Something has been building in you for a long time. You can feel it, this low hum underneath everything, like a frequency just below what your conscious mind can register. You can't name it, you can't explain it to anyone, but it's there when you wake up at odd hours. It's there when the life you're living suddenly feels like a rehearsal for something you haven't started yet. It's there in the strange restlessness that won't go away, no matter how much you try to distract yourself from it. Everyone around you sees someone who's stuck, maybe struggling, maybe lost. They see the confusion, the withdrawal, the quiet intensity you carry and don't know what to do with. They see someone whose life doesn't match their potential, whose trajectory seems stalled, whose best years look like they might be slipping past unused. And some part of you has started believing their assessment, because when you look at the evidence, at where you are versus where you thought you'd be by now, it's hard to argue. But Carl Jung spent decades studying people in exactly this position, and what he found would have unsettled every person offering you their well-meaning concern. Jung discovered that the periods where a person appears most stuck are frequently the periods where the most significant internal restructuring is taking place. That what looks like stagnation from the outside is often preparation from the inside, and that the people who eventually rise to levels nobody anticipated almost always go through an extended season where nothing visible is happening, because everything that matters is happening where no one, including the person themselves, can see it. Today, I'm going to walk you through what Jung understood about this invisible preparation, the specific psychological shifts that occur during these seemingly dormant periods, why the people around you can't recognize what's actually taking place, and what it means for where you're headed. Because if you've been carrying the weight of feeling behind, feeling overlooked, feeling like the life you're supposed to be living keeps hovering just out of reach, there's a strong chance that what you're interpreting as delay is actually the deepest form of development you've ever undergone. Jung was fascinated by the gap between what's visible and what's real in a person's psychological development. He saw this gap everywhere in his practice. Patients who appeared to be deteriorating while something essential was consolidating inside them. Patients who looked successful while slowly hollowing out. Patients who seemed to be going nowhere while their entire psychic architecture was being rebuilt from the foundations up. And he learned, over years of careful observation, to stop trusting surfaces. One of his most significant insights came from studying what he called the movement of psychic energy, the way the life force within a person redirects itself during major transitions. Jung noticed that before any significant external change in a person's life, there was always an internal redistribution of energy that preceded it. Energy would withdraw from the places it had been flowing: careers, relationships, social identities, ambitions, and seemingly disappear. The person would feel flat, drained, unmotivated. The things that used to drive them would lose their pull. And to everyone watching, this looked like depression, burnout, or failure to launch. But Jung recognized something different in this withdrawal. He saw the psyche pulling its resources inward the way an army pulls back from its front lines before a major offensive. The energy wasn't gone. It was being redirected towards something the conscious mind hadn't caught up with yet. Something was being assembled in the unconscious, a new orientation, a new capacity, a new version of the person, and that assembly required fuel. So the psyche took the fuel from wherever it could, which meant draining the energy out of the person's existing life and making everything feel strangely empty. This is the part that nobody warns you about. The period before a significant rise looks and feels almost indistinguishable from the period of genuine decline. The symptoms are eerily similar: loss of motivation, disconnection from previous goals, social withdrawal, a persistent sense that something fundamental is off. And because we live in a culture that has no framework for productive dormancy, for necessary withdrawal, for the kind of invisible preparation that precedes real transformation, everyone around you, including you, interprets these symptoms as evidence that something has gone wrong. Jung would have told you the opposite. He would have said that something is finally going right, and that the discomfort you're feeling is the friction of a psyche that's outgrowing the container it's been living in. Think about what happens to a seed underground. For weeks, sometimes months, there's absolutely zero visible activity. The ground looks bare. If you didn't know better, you'd assume nothing was planted, or that whatever was planted had failed. But beneath the surface, an enormously complex process is underway. The seed coat is softening, the embryo inside is swelling, pushing against its casing, beginning the painstaking work of sending roots downward into soil it can't see, and a shoot upward toward light it can't yet feel. The seed doesn't know that light exists above it. It has no evidence. It simply grows toward it because something encoded deep in its structure compels it to move in that direction. Jung saw the same dynamic at work in people who were approaching their most significant periods of growth. They couldn't see what they were growing toward. They had no evidence that the energy being pulled from their current life was fueling something worthwhile. They just felt the loss, the diminishment of interest, the fading of old passions, the slow evacuation of meaning from structures that used to hold them together. And the temptation to interpret all of this as personal failure was almost irresistible, because every external metric confirmed that interpretation. But the metrics were measuring the wrong thing. They were measuring the life the person was leaving, not the life the person was moving toward. They were quantifying the dismantling and calling it decline, completely blind to the construction happening underneath. This brings us to something Jung observed that's directly relevant to wherever you are right now. He noticed that the people who eventually rose to unexpected levels, the ones who transformed in ways that shocked everyone who knew them, almost universally shared a common trait during their dormant period. They carried a knowing they couldn't justify, a conviction that sat somewhere below logic, below evidence, below anything they could point to and say, "This is why I believe things are going to change." It was cellular rather than intellectual, irrational in the best sense of the word, and it persisted even when everything visible contradicted it. Jung connected this to what he called the self, the deeper organizing center of the psyche that operates beyond the ego's limited perspective. The ego sees only what's in front of it, the stalled career, the thinning social circle, the gap between aspiration and reality. The self sees the full trajectory. It holds the blueprint the ego can't access. And during these dormant periods, the self communicates through intuition, through that stubborn inner knowing, through dreams and flashes of conviction that arrive without explanation and refuse to leave no matter how many times the rational mind tries to dismiss them. If you've felt that quiet, unexplainable certainty that you're meant for something your current life doesn't reflect, Jung would tell you to pay close attention. Because the ego doesn't generate that kind of knowing. The ego generates ambition, comparison, anxiety about status. That deeper knowing, the one that persists without evidence, comes from a part of you that can see further than your conscious mind allows. And its persistence, especially in the face of circumstances that should have extinguished it, is one of the most reliable indicators that the rise is already underway. Let's talk about what's actually being built during this period, because it's more specific than vague spiritual preparation. Jung identified concrete psychological developments that occur during extended dormancy, developments that have to happen before the external shift can manifest. Miss these, rush through them, or try to bypass them, and whatever you build on the other side will be just as hollow as what you left behind. The first development is what Jung would have called the integration of unlived potential. Every person carries within them capacities, qualities, and strengths that never found expression in the life they originally constructed. Maybe you built your identity around being reliable and steady, so the bold, creative, risk-taking part of you went underground. Maybe you learned early that being visible made you a target, so your natural charisma and authority got locked away where it couldn't attract attention. Maybe your family system required you to stay small, so every impulse toward expansion got suppressed before it could fully form. During the dormant period, these unlived parts start surfacing. You feel drawn to things that don't match your established identity. You start having thoughts and impulses that surprise you, interests that seem to come from nowhere, desires that feel foreign to the person you've been. This isn't randomness. It's the integration of capacities that have been waiting, sometimes for decades, to be let into the room. And they're arriving now because the old identity has loosened enough to make space for them. Jung saw this integration as absolutely essential for any genuine rise, Because the version of you that's been operating until now, the one built from childhood conditioning, social expectations, survival strategies, that version has a ceiling. It can only go as high as its programming allows, and its programming was designed for safety, not for the full expression of who you actually are. The rise that's coming requires access to parts of yourself that the old programming kept locked out, and the dormant period is when those parts get unlocked. The second development is a fundamental reorganization of values. Jung observed that people approaching a significant transformation often went through a disorienting period where their existing value system stopped working. Things they'd chased their whole lives, approval, achievement, security, social standing, started feeling hollow. And things they'd always dismissed or overlooked, solitude, depth, creative expression, inner alignment, started pulling at them with unexpected force. This reorganization feels deeply uncomfortable because your entire life has been organized around the old value system. Your career was chosen based on it. Your relationships were structured by it. Your daily habits, your goals, your definition of a good day, all of it was built on a foundation of values that are now shifting beneath you. And when the foundation shifts, everything built on top of it starts to wobble. Jung recognized this wobble as a sign of psychological maturation rather than instability. He distinguished between what he called ego values, the values imposed by external conditioning, designed to help you succeed within existing systems, and self-values, the values that emerge from your authentic nature, designed to align you with your actual purpose. The dormant period is when self-values begin overriding ego values, and the conflict between the two, the confusion about what you actually care about, the sense of not knowing what you want anymore, that's the sound of deeper values breaking through surface ones. The third development is perhaps the most counterintuitive. Jung noticed that the people who rose to unexpected levels almost always went through a period of what he called voluntary ego reduction, a phase where the ego's ambitions, self-images, and need for external validation were systematically stripped away. The person didn't choose this consciously. It happened to them through circumstances that felt like repeated failure, like humiliation, like being forced into positions of invisibility and powerlessness. This experience felt punishing. It looked, from the outside and the inside, like the universe had singled them out for some kind of sustained demolition. But Jung saw a purpose in the demolition that the ego couldn't perceive while it was happening. The ego had to be reduced because the ego, as it existed, was too rigid and too fragile to hold what was coming. It was like trying to pour an ocean into a teacup. The container has to be fundamentally restructured before it can receive something that vast. Every setback during the dormant period, every rejection, every failure, every moment where you felt invisible and overlooked, was reshaping the container, making it more flexible, more resilient, more capable of holding success without being destroyed by it. Because Jung observed something crucial about people who rise without adequate ego preparation. They shatter. They reach levels they aren't psychologically built for, and the success either inflates them until they become insufferable, or it overwhelms them until they self-destruct. The ego reduction that feels like punishment is actually the psyche's way of ensuring you'll be able to sustain what's coming. If something in what I'm describing resonates, if you're in a season that feels like preparation for something you can't see yet, and you're looking for a way to work with it rather than just endure it, we've put together a resource that might help. It's called True Self-Discovery, 24 reflection exercises rooted in Jung's approach to understanding these exact inner shifts. The kind of exercises that help you hear what your psyche is trying to communicate during these in-between stretches, so you can cooperate with the process instead of fighting it. You'll find the link just below this video. There's another dimension to this that Jung explored extensively, and it has to do with timing. Specifically, why the rise happens when it does, and why it can't be forced to happen sooner. Jung studied what he called synchronicity, meaningful coincidences that can't be explained by cause and effect, but that seem to carry a significance beyond chance. And he noticed that people in the late stages of dormancy, the ones who'd done the internal work without knowing they were doing it, started experiencing an unusual uptick in synchronistic events. the right person appearing at the right moment, an opportunity surfacing from a completely unexpected direction, a conversation that rearranges everything, a door opening that the person didn't even know existed, let alone tried to open. Jung didn't attribute this to magic or manifestation in the way those concepts get used today. He understood it as the result of internal alignment. When your conscious orientation finally comes into harmony with your unconscious direction, when the ego stops fighting the self's agenda and starts cooperating with it, you begin to perceive and respond to opportunities that were always present but invisible to you while you were internally divided. The opportunities didn't materialize out of thin air. You became capable of seeing them because your psychology was finally organized in a way that allowed it. This is why forcing the timeline doesn't work. You can hustle, you can strategize, you can network and position yourself, and do everything the productivity culture tells you to do. And all of that effort lands on a psyche that isn't ready yet, a psyche still divided between what the ego wants and what the self is building. And the effort either produces hollow results or no results at all. The timing of the rise correlates with the completion of the internal preparation, and that preparation has its own schedule. It can't be rushed any more than you can rush the setting of concrete. Apply pressure too early, and you compromise the structural integrity of what's being built. Jung saw this play out repeatedly in patients who tried to force breakthroughs before their psyche was ready. They'd manufacture external changes, new jobs, new cities, new relationships, hoping the novelty would ignite the transformation they could feel lurking. And the changes would feel exciting for a few weeks, sometimes months, before settling into the same flatness they were running from. Because the flatness wasn't about their circumstances. It was about the gap between where their ego was operating and where their self was building. Until that gap closed through genuine internal development, no external change could substitute. The people who actually rose, the ones whose transformation shocked everyone who knew them, were almost always the ones who'd stopped trying to force the timing. They'd surrendered to the dormancy, often with enormous reluctance, and allowed the internal process to complete itself. And when it completed, the external shift happened with a speed and decisiveness that stunned them as much as it stunned everyone watching. Years of apparent stagnation, followed by a rapid, almost explosive emergence into a completely different level of functioning. The seed spending months in darkness, then breaking through the soil in what looks, from the surface, like an overnight event. There's something else Jung understood about this rising that gets overlooked in most conversations about transformation. He knew that the level someone rises to is directly proportional to the depth of the preparation they underwent. Shallow dormancy produces shallow change. Deep, prolonged, genuinely agonizing periods of invisible preparation produce the kind of change that redefines a person's entire trajectory. This is terrible news if you're looking for reassurance that the hard part is almost over. But it's extraordinary news if you're willing to reframe what you've been going through. Because the depth of your dormancy, how long it's lasted, how thoroughly it's dismantled your old identity, how completely it's stripped away the things you used to rely on, is an indicator of how significant the rise will be. Jung would have said that the psyche doesn't invest this much energy in demolition unless what it's planning to construct requires cleared ground on a massive scale. Think about the people throughout history who rose to levels nobody anticipated. Jung studied figures like this, people whose early lives gave no indication of what they'd become, who spent years in obscurity or apparent failure before emerging into their full capacity. And he found the same pattern again and again. Extended dormancy, invisible preparation, a period that historians later glossed over or described as difficult early years, but that was actually the foundational phase without which nothing that followed would have been possible. The person they became on the other side of that preparation wasn't a better version of who they were before. It was a qualitatively different person. Someone operating from a center of gravity that didn't exist prior to the dormancy. Someone whose relationship to power, to purpose, to their own capability had been fundamentally restructured during those invisible years. They hadn't just grown, they'd been rebuilt. And the rebuilding could only happen in the dark, away from external pressures and expectations, in the protected space of apparent failure. Jung connected this to an alchemical principle he returned to throughout his career. The alchemists spoke of the opus contra naturam, the work against nature. They meant that genuine transformation requires going against the natural inclination of the material. The natural inclination of the human ego is toward comfort, toward certainty, toward maintaining existing structures. Transformation demands the opposite: discomfort, uncertainty, the willingness to let existing structures dissolve. And the dormant period is where this unnatural work takes place. You're being reshaped against the grain of everything you've known, and it feels wrong precisely because it goes against every instinct the ego has developed. Let me address something directly, because if you've read this far, there's likely a question burning underneath everything else. How do you know, how can you actually tell, whether what you're in is genuine preparation or just stagnation? Whether the dormancy is building towards something or just consuming years you won't get back? Jung was honest about the difficulty of distinguishing between the two from the inside, but he identified markers that separated productive dormancy from genuine stuckness. And the difference, he found, wasn't in the external circumstances, which could look identical in both cases, but in the internal experience. Productive dormancy involves change you can feel but can't yet see. Your relationship to yourself is shifting. Your reactions to old triggers are evolving. You catch yourself thinking in ways that surprise you, wanting things that don't match your established pattern. There's movement happening, just not where anyone can observe it, including you most of the time. You're different than you were 6 months ago, even if your life looks exactly the same. Genuine stuckness, by contrast, involves repetition without evolution, the same patterns cycling, the same reactions firing, the same relationship to yourself, to others, to your circumstances, preserved in amber month after month. There's no internal movement. The dormancy is static rather than dynamic. If you're being honest with yourself, and this is the kind of honesty that matters here, you probably already know which one you're in. The fact that you're drawn to content like this, that something in you resonates with the concept of invisible preparation, that you carry that unexplainable knowing despite having zero evidence to support it, these are markers. They're signs of a psyche in motion. A truly stuck person doesn't wonder whether they're being prepared for something. They've stopped wondering about anything. They've settled into the repetition and made peace with the ceiling. You haven't made peace with it. That restlessness you keep trying to talk yourself out of, that refusal to fully settle into the life that everyone else seems content with, that persistent sense that you're supposed to be doing something you haven't started yet. Jung would recognize all of it. He'd recognize it as the self refusing to let the ego get comfortable in a life that's too small. And he'd tell you something that might be hard to hear, but is worth hearing anyway. The people around you who are concerned, who think you're lost, who keep trying to pull you back toward the conventional path, they're responding to the version of you they knew, the version that fit into the existing framework, the version whose trajectory was predictable and whose needs were manageable. They're not being malicious. They genuinely believe that the person they knew was the real you, and that the unsettled, searching, dormant person you've become is a deviation from your true self. Jung would have said they have it exactly backwards. The person they knew was the deviation, the performed version, the accommodated version, the version that learned early how to shape itself to fit other people's expectations. That was the detour. And the discomfort you're living in now, the dismantling of that performed self, the uncomfortable gap between who you were and who you haven't yet become, this is the return to the main road. It doesn't feel like a return because you've never actually been on this road before. You've only been on the detour, so the detour felt like the real path. The actual path feels foreign precisely because it's genuinely yours. This is where Jung's concept of individuation becomes directly relevant. Individuation is the process of becoming who you actually are rather than who you were conditioned to be. And Jung observed that this process accelerates during dormant periods because the ego's defenses are lowered. When life is going well by conventional standards, the ego has no reason to loosen its grip. Everything's working, so why change? But when the conventional rewards stop satisfying, when the old identity starts crumbling, When the life you built stops feeling like yours, that's when the ego's hold weakens enough for the authentic self to start pushing through. The rise that no one sees coming is the rise of the individuated self. The person who's been assembled in the dark, forged from integrated shadow material and unlived potential and reorganized values, and an ego that's been made flexible enough to serve rather than dominate. This person doesn't climb the same ladder everyone else is climbing. They step onto a different one entirely, one that doesn't even become visible until the internal preparation is complete. Jung noticed that this emergence often caught even the person experiencing it off guard. They'd spend months or years feeling dormant, feeling behind, feeling like the gap between their inner sense of capacity and their external reality was going to swallow them. And then something would shift. Quickly, often within a compressed time frame that bore no relationship to the years of preparation that preceded it. A door would open, a clarity would arrive, a decision would form with the kind of clean, unrevisable certainty that the ego, left to its own devices, never produces. And the person would move, decisively, almost magnetically, into a phase of their life that made everything before it look like preliminary sketching. The people around them, the ones who'd watched the dormancy and interpreted it as failure, would describe this as sudden. They'd marvel at the seeming overnight transformation and either celebrate it or resent it, depending on their own relationship to change. But the person experiencing it would know the truth. There was nothing sudden about it. Every month of apparent stagnation was a month of invisible construction. Every setback was a refinement. Every period of crushing self-doubt was the ego being carved into a shape that could hold what was coming. Jung called the phenomenon enantiodromia, the principle that things, at the peak of their intensity, transform into their opposite. The deepest dormancy flips into the most powerful emergence. The most complete darkness precedes the most significant dawn. The compression produces the spring. He saw it in his patients with such consistency that he came to regard it as one of the most reliable patterns in psychological development. The bottom and the breakthrough aren't separate events. They're the same event, experienced from different moments in time. If you're reading this in what feels like the bottom, in the compressed, airless, invisible phase where nothing is working and no one understands, and you're starting to wonder whether that inner knowing you've been carrying has been lying to you this whole time, I want you to consider the possibility that you're standing inside the coiled spring, that the compression you feel is energy being stored, that the invisibility you're experiencing is the cocoon, and cocoons don't have windows because what's happening inside them isn't meant to be watched, it's meant to be undergone. You're about to rise to a level that the people currently in your life don't have a framework for. They're measuring you against a version of success that belongs to the old value system, the one that's being replaced inside you right now. The level you're moving toward doesn't exist on their map. It couldn't, because it's a level that only becomes accessible through the specific kind of preparation you've been undergoing, the kind that looks like nothing from the outside and costs everything on the inside. Jung would have told you that this is the most dangerous and the most important moment. Dangerous because the temptation to abandon the process, to settle for something familiar, to silence the inner knowing, to convince yourself that the dormancy really was just failure and the rise was just wishful thinking, is at its absolute strongest right before the emergence begins. Important because what you do in this moment, whether you keep trusting the process or collapse back into the old pattern, will determine whether the preparation fulfills its purpose or gets buried under another layer of compromise. He spent his career watching people make both choices. Some held on, some let go. And the difference between those two outcomes, between a life that breaks through and a life that breaks down, often came down to a single decision made in the darkest part of the dormancy. The decision to keep standing when every piece of visible evidence says sitting down is the rational response. What you're carrying right now, that weight that everyone else reads as struggle, is the mass of a future self that hasn't arrived yet, but is pressing against the membrane of the present. You can feel it pushing. You felt it for a while. The pressure that won't let you settle. The knowing that won't let you quit. the restlessness that won't let you accept a life you've outgrown. That pressure is the rise, announcing itself the only way it can before it becomes visible. And the fact that no one around you can see it yet changes nothing about its reality. Seeds don't need spectators. They need time and darkness and the willingness to keep growing towards something they've never seen but somehow know is there. Jung staked his entire understanding of psychological development on this principle, that the human psyche moves toward wholeness the way water moves toward the sea, inevitably, relentlessly, through whatever terrain stands in the way. Your job has never been to manufacture the rise. Your job has been to stop obstructing the one that's already been underway for longer than you realize, building in silence, gathering force in the dark, preparing to surface with a momentum that has nothing to do with effort and everything to do with readiness. You're closer than you think, closer than the circumstances suggest, closer than the people around you believe, closer than your own exhausted, battered ego is able to admit. The preparation that felt like punishment, the dormancy that felt like death, the invisibility that felt like erasure, all of it has been building toward a version of you that nobody saw coming, including yourself. That version is almost ready. You can feel it in the pressure, in the knowing, in the stubborn, irrational refusal to accept a life that's smaller than what you sense is possible. Hold that refusal. It's the most honest thing about you right now, and it's the thread connected to everything that's about to change. If you're in this stretch right now, feeling the pressure, sensing the shift, trying to hold your ground while everything around you says give up, our guide, True Self-Discovery, was built for exactly where you're standing. 24 reflection exercises drawn from Jung's work, designed to help you stay connected to what's forming inside you when the outside world offers nothing but static. The link is right below.